In this lesson, we're going to be looking at the phylum Cnidaria. And the photograph here is one that I took of a close-up of a type of coral. It's actually a hard coral, but the polyps themselves each of these is like an individual coral polyp, and together they form a colony that is the whole coral, the mound or the boulder, if you will. And I wanted to show you, first of all, how amazing it is to see these things close up. But they are similar to anemones, although they are not called anemones. They do belong to that same phylum, though, as anemones, which is Cnidaria. So let's start with our phylogenetic tree that we've been following as we've been studying the different types of organisms. We left off in our last lesson with the sponges, which is the basal group of animals. And if you recall, that means it's the earliest group to diverge from the other descendant groups of animals. So cnidarians would have come about after sponges. And the characteristic that differentiates the cnidarians from the sponges is that they have true tissues. Sponges do not have tissues. They have different kinds of cells that make their bodies up, but not true tissues. And if you remember from Bio 1, tissues are groups of cells that are working together to perform a particular function. So because cnidarians have true tissues, this is our first group of eumetazoans, or true animals. And this group can be dated back 680 million years ago, with fossils, that is. So now let's look at what else differentiates cnidarians, not just from the sponges, because other animals are eumetazoans and have true tissues. It's not just the cnidarians that has those characteristics, but what cnidarians have that the others don't are, in addition to the true tissues, they come in a diverse type of forms, including both sessile, which means that they don't move around on their own, and modal forms that can swim through the water or drift with the water, like the scyphozoans in the middle. The cnidarians can be further broken down into three major classes, and they are the hydrozoans, scyphozoans, and anthozoans. So we're going to look at each of these classes in a bit more detail and include some examples, starting with hydrozoans. Probably the hydrozoan that you're most familiar with is the one shown on the left, the Portuguese man-o-war. It's actually not a traditional jellyfish. It's in the same phylum, it is cnidarian, but it doesn't belong to the same class as the jellies, which is our next class, the scyphozoans. In fact, Portuguese man-o-war is actually a colonial organism. So its body, although it looks like one organism, is made of many hydrozoans, all living together in a colony. Another example is on the right here, not the hermit crab, but what it's crawling on. He's a brave little guy. I guess he doesn't get affected by the stinging cells of the fire coral. The fire coral is this mustard brown branching structure that the hermit crab is crawling on, and as its name implies, it feels like fire if you brush up against this stuff. And trust me, I know. I've actually ran into it with my knee before, and it felt like a brush burn, like a rug burn that just wouldn't go away for a while. It healed just fine, no long-term damages, but you definitely don't want to go out of your way to touch fire coral. But it's all over in the Caribbean and also off of South Florida, so I was able to get a picture of that. All right, let's take a look at our next class, the scyphozoans, which are the jellyfish. The ones shown here are Cassiopeia, or the upside-down jellyfish, and these are common in Florida Bay, as if you were driving down to the Keys, the waters that are on both sides of the road as you're driving down US 1, there are likely jellyfish, upside down jellyfish in there. So what's interesting about them is, well, they're upside down. So their tentacles, which contain the stinging cells, are actually right side up, facing, the surface. But these guys don't just sting if you touch them. They actually release mucus in the water. So you might experience this before, where you go into the water, you don't see a jellyfish anywhere, but you start feeling kind of itchy and a little bit tingly and stingy. It could actually be from the mucus of a jellyfish, such as the Cassiopeia. Moon jellies are another type of scyphozoan, and these are ones that we commonly see in South Florida. And they seem to be more prevalent during certain times of year than others. I think fall and winter is when they have their mass numbers, migrations, versus in the summertime. So unlike the Cassiopeia, the moon jellies are oriented in the other direction, which would be considered right side up. As shown here in the little sketch on the right, their body is comprised of the tentacles, which come from the top, from the dome part, and then their mouth and anus, which is the same opening, is on their ventral side. So the dorsal side is like the dome, tentacles, mouth, and anus are on the ventral side. This state is called the Medusa state for a jellyfish. And that doesn't just apply to moon jellies. Any jelly that has this general body plan is referred to as the Medusa state for that jellyfish. And now to the third and my favorite class of cnidarians, the anthozoans, which includes the corals, both stony corals like the one I showed at the beginning, also here again, and soft corals. All corals here shown here are colonial organisms. The anemone is also a representative of the anthozoan. And this is a beautiful anemone. It reminded me of like a lily. I think it's actually called something about a lily anemone, but it's solitary. It's a single polyp, and it was just in the sand. And this was a night dive that I saw it. So how you can see this like green fluorescent banding around its oral cavity, and also where the anus is, same opening. That was like that in nature. So they have some really beautiful colorations that must be an adaptation for how they feed at night. Perhaps small plankton are attracted to the glowing green color. I'm not quite sure, didn't get to observe that, but I'm sure there's a reason why it has that fluorescent banding pattern, because I did see it out feeding at night, and I've never seen them during the day. So with that, let's talk about how they eat. I've mentioned about their mouth being the same opening as the anus. So when we look at the polyp state, unlike the Medusa state, it's kind of flipped over, but polyps are generally sessile, attached to some kind of substrate or embedded in the bottom, versus the Medusa state is the pelagic form, or the one that can swim or drift in the water. So they have that single opening where they take in food. The tentacles are usually, they have stinging cells. And the stinging cells, which are called cnidocytes, shown on the right, they get activated when something touches them. So all it takes is for something to physically touch the tentacle to trigger the barbs, the nematocysts with the barbs, to fire, and it actually gets like ejected from the cnidocyte, the cell containing the nematocysts, and this is what traps the food. And sometimes, depending on the species of cnidarian, it can actually stun the prey. It can sting them, but also just trap them because it has the barb and this thread that kind of wraps around things. So they use their tentacles to capture the prey, and then they bring them to their mouth. So their cnidocytes can be used both to help with feeding and also to defend themselves from being predated upon. Now, the ability of the Cnidarians to respond to having something touch the tentacle, trigger the release of the nematocyst, the stinging cell, and then send that response back to the rest of the body to bring that food in, or to maybe retract the polyps to protect it from predation. They have to have some kind of a nerve response for that. So, but they don't have a nervous system per se. They have what's called a non-centralized nerve net, where they can detect and respond to stimuli from all directions because of the nerve net that is within their entire body structure, but there's no centralized location where that information gets received or transmitted. So no brain. And that concludes our lesson on Cnidarians.